Hazal is a nickname for the Jewish sages who lived and worked during the Second Temple period and after. They shaped the foundations of the Oral Torah, which became the Talmud and the basis of Jewish law. The history of their formation begins with the members of the Great Knesset. During the period of Shabbat Zion, and continues throughout the periods of the Sanhedrin, the conditions, the Amorites, the Savorites, the geniuses and the first ones. Members of the Great Knesset, they are central figures in the history of the Jewish people, and are considered one of the most important periods in the history of the nation of Israel. They were part of a group of sages and spiritual leaders who were active during the return of Zion, after the destruction of the First Temple, in the 5th and 4th centuries BC. Back in Babylon, their role was to restore the life of the Jewish people. In the land of Israel after the return, the Babylonian exile laid the foundations for what is known today as Judaism. The Sanhedrin was the supreme spiritual legal institution of the people of Israel during the Second Temple period, and its operation continued even after the destruction of the Temple, until around the 5th century AD. The Sanhedrin was the central body for halakhic ruling, for the religious leadership of the people, for deciding complex issues related to the laws of the Torah. The council consisted of 71 members, headed by the president, that he had supreme authority. The couples period. The period of couples began in the 2nd century BC, shortly before the destruction of the Second Temple, and is known as a divided period full of conflicts with the institution of the priesthood. During this period, the Sanhedrin was headed by two leaders, the president and the father of the court, hence the couples' nicknames. Some of the most famous couples are Hillel and Shammai, whose methods and halakhic concepts deeply influenced the design of the Oral Torah. The terms operated mainly in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. They were the sages who learned and interpreted the Oral Torah. Their words were finally collected in the Mishnah, edited by Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi in the 3rd century. The Mishnah is the main file of the Oral Torah and forms the basis of the Talmud. The Amorites period. The Amorites operated in the 3rd to 5th centuries AD, and they were engaged in explaining and expanding the Mishnah. Their words were written in the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud. The Talmud is the main work of the Amorites and is the main source of Jewish law. After the destruction of the First Temple in 586 BC, the people of Israel were exiled to Babylon. The Babylonian exile was a traumatic event for the Jewish people, and with it comes a period of reflection, internal repair, and searching for a way to preserve religious and national identity. Those who took the reins into their hands were a group of elites under priestly leadership, and the influence of Persian Babylonian culture. In 538 BC, Cyrus the Great declared, king of Persia, about the declaration of Cyrus, which allowed the Jews to return to the land of Israel and rebuild the temple. Many of the Jews took advantage of the opportunity and returned to Eretz Israel, but they faced great challenges in the restoration of religious and community life. The members of the Great Knesset were the main group, who led the process of restoring the religious and national life of the Jewish people. Tradition attributes a number of important enterprises to the members of the Great Knesset. 1. Determining the wording of the prayers. One of the main actions of the members of the Great Knesset was determining the wording of the prayers, as we know it today. They determined the wording of the standing prayer, 18, morning, evening prayers and more. The prayers they prescribed became the center of Jewish religious worship, especially after the destruction of the Second Temple, when it was no longer possible to worship in the temple. 2. Editing the Bible. The members of the Great Knesset are credited with editing the canon of the Bible, that is, in determining the books included in the Bible. They arranged the books according to the Torah, prophets, and scriptures, and created the structure of the Bible as we know it today. 3. Laying down the foundations of the Oral Torah. Alongside the written Torah, the members of the Great Knesset laid the foundations for the Oral Torah. They developed the customs and laws that were handed down from generation to generation, what eventually passed into the Mishnah and the Talmud. 4. Establishment of the Sanhedrin. Jewish tradition attributes the establishment of the Sanhedrin to the members of the Great Knesset, the Supreme Council of the Sages of Israel, which acted as a supreme court, a center for spiritual leadership, and as a legislature. The Sanhedrin was the supreme institution of the Jewish people during and after the Second Temple period. The Sanhedrin consisted of 71 members, which included sages, priests, and a president who heads them. Tradition attributes a number of important figures to the members of the Great Knesset. 1. Ezra the scribe. Ezra was one of the main leaders during the return of Zion, and he is considered the central figure in the members of the Great Knesset. He was responsible for renewing and editing the Torah and bequeathing it to the people of Israel. Ezra led the return from Babylon, established the regulations and laws that strengthened the observance of the Torah among the people, and laid the foundations for what is known today as Rabbinic Judaism. 3. Shimon the Righteous. Shimon the Righteous, who is considered one of the most prominent sages among the members of the Great Knesset, he was a high priest and served as head of the Sanhedrin. He was considered an accepted and beloved figure among the people, and it is said of him that he is a leaver of the Great Knesset, that is, one of the relics of the period. After the conquests of Alexander the Great in the 4th century BC, Hellenistic culture spread throughout the Middle East, including Judea. Hellenism brought with it many cultural and political influences, which included art, philosophy, customs, and even foreign gods. These influences began to permeate Jewish society as well, and caused internal tensions in the nation between those who adopted the Hellenistic culture and those who sought to preserve the Jewish tradition, which led to the formation of the Pharisees, a religious group that emerged in the 2nd century BC. They were committed to preserving Jewish law and interpreting it in a way that allows the people to maintain their Jewish identity in a changing world. They resisted Hellenistic influences, which sometimes included desecration of the Torah commandments and the introduction of foreign cults into Jerusalem. The struggle between the Pharisees and the Hellenistic influences reached its peak during the Hasmonean Revolt, 160 to 167 BC. The Hasmoneans, led by Matthew and his sons, revolted against the rule of Antiochus Epiphanes the Seleucid, who sought to impose the Hellenistic culture on the Jews was forbidden from observing the mitzvot of the Torah. The Pharisees supported this rebellion, considered a struggle to preserve Jewish tradition. In the Roman period, the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin were factors central in shaping the halakha and the leadership of the Jewish people. This period was characterized by significant challenges such as foreign rule, internal political and religious tensions, and finally the Great Rebellion that led to the destruction of the Second Temple. The Great Revolt against the Romans, 66 to 70 AD, was a decisive event in the history of the Jewish people, which began in 66 AD. The reasons for the rebellion were many, including economic, religious, and political injustices, which were the result of Roman rule. The Pharisees were divided on the question of rebellion. Some saw him as hope for liberation from Roman rule and supported him, but many of them, and especially the leadership of the Sanhedrin, opposed the rebellion. They saw the rebellion as a great danger not only to Jewish rule but also to the existence of Judaism itself. The opposition of the Pharisees to the revolt stemmed mainly from a realistic understanding of the huge military gap between the Jewish people and Rome, and especially from the fratricidal war that took place in those days, out of fear that the rebellion would lead to great destruction. In addition, they were concerned about harming the religious and legal autonomy of the Jews. They tried to preserve it under Roman rule. The Great Rebellion ended in terrible destruction, the destruction of the Second Temple, the destruction of Jerusalem, and the exile of many of the Jews of the land of Israel. The Pharisees, who were involved in shaping Jewish law and tradition, they understood that they had to adapt Judaism to the new reality. After the destruction of the Second Temple in AD 70, the Pharisees faced extremely significant challenges that threatened the existence and continuity of traditional Judaism. The destruction created a new reality in which it was necessary to rebuild the Jewish and religious identity without a temple, and in the process to deal with the spread of Christianity, the effects of Hellenism, and different Jewish sects that offered different interpretations and ideas for how Jewish worship should be performed. After the destruction of the temple, the Pharisees, who became the central factor in Jewish leadership, realized that they had to adapt the religion to the new reality. The temple was the religious center of the Jewish people, and most of the commandments were related to him. Without the temple, there was a fear that religion would lose its central anchor. The main reaction of the Pharisees was to emphasize the Oral Torah, which until then was a tradition that had not yet been written. They worked to create a new religious framework that focused on the study of the Torah, in observing mitzvot at home and in the community, and in the development of new institutions such as synagogues and midrash schools. This center developed in the city of Yavne. There the Sanhedrin reconvened and began to deal with these tasks. Christianity, which grew out of Judaism at the end of the Second Temple, became a great challenge for the Pharisees after the destruction. Initially, Christianity was a small Jewish sect that began to grow after the destruction out of a messianic concept that would restore the temple, but over time it spread and developed into a separate religion. The first Christians were Jews. But they began to move away from Jewish law and preach new ideas such as the belief in Jesus as the Messiah and the Son of God. Opposition to the Pharisees and Jewish law was a central part of their teachings, and they tried to attract Jews to convert their religion. Hellenistic culture, which has been dominant in the Middle East since the conquests of Alexander the Great, continued to influence the Jews even after the destruction of the house. Hellenism represented a foreign culture with values different from those of Judaism, like polytheism, a life of pleasure and emphasizing the body and aesthetics. The Pharisees had to deal with Jews who were influenced by Hellenism and adopted parts of this culture. Besides Christianity and Hellenism, during this period there were also other Jewish sects, like the Essenes and the Zealots, who posed another challenge to the Pharisees. The Essenes, this sect was a monastic group that abhorred ordinary political and social life, concentrated on celibate life, purification, and the worship of Hashem in a different style than that of the Pharisees. They opposed the Pharisees on the basis of their approach to practical life and halakha. The Zealots, this sect was an extreme nationalist group that believed in an armed struggle against the Romans and foreign rule. The Zealots saw themselves as Torah keepers, and fighting for the return of the monarchy to the tribe of Judah, but they opposed the Pharisees who were more pragmatic in relation to the Romans. The Pharisees managed to face the challenges, these by creating the Pardes and the Pardes Midrash with his genius. It contained not only the biblical canon and its interpretation by the Oral Torah, also to the outer and mythological wisdom literature. And so a mystical puffer was created that attracted members of other sects to him. The Midrash houses were built in a form that can be compared in some ways to the Jewish Midrash houses. To the schools of the Greek philosophers, although there were significant differences between the two in their goals, their methods, and their study contents. Both institutions were centers for study and conceptual development. In the Midrash schools, students learned oral and written Torah, laws, and religious thought, and also the stories of Greek philosophers such as Plato or Lycian. Engaged students in a variety of fields such as logic, ethics, physics, and mathematics. Discussions and dialogues. In the Midrash houses as well as in the philosophical schools, there were extensive discussions and dialogues between the teacher and the students and between the students themselves. In these places, look for the truth and a deeper understanding through questions, debates, and deepening the content being studied. Transmission of tradition and heritage. Both in the Midrash houses and in the Greek philosophical schools, there was a transmission of knowledge and tradition from generation to generation. In the seminaries the tradition was Torah and religious, while in the philosophical schools the tradition was philosophical and scientific. The Midrash schools and the Greek philosophical schools served as centers for study and conceptual development, with a certain similarity in structure and teaching methods. However, their goals and study contents were fundamentally different. The Midrash schools were religious institutions that sought to preserve and expand Jewish law, and maintaining a certain flexibility in the interpretation of the halakha, and emphasizing the unity of the people around the Oral Torah and the written Torah. They understood that they must avoid internal wars and hold halakhic and moral discussions while maintaining the halakhic framework. Summary: the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin formed the mainstay of Judaism in the Roman period, and were involved in shaping Jewish law and tradition as we know it today. Despite the great challenges and crises experienced during this period, they managed to ensure the continuity of Judaism after the destruction of the Second Temple and deal with the effects of Hellenism and the changing reality of the period after the destruction of the Second Temple. The attitude of the Pharisees became which emphasized the importance of the Oral Torah and adaptation to halakha even in changing times, to the central norm in Judaism. What made possible the establishment of holy communities? The Sanhedrin continued to function until the 5th century AD, and her legacy is still evident today in the Rabbinic Jewish tradition. Sages shaped and expanded the Oral Torah, which was passed down from generation to generation. It developed and was edited until it became the detailed halakhic system of Rabbinic Judaism. Their work continued for hundreds of years and had a profound effect on Judaism, when their main works, the Mishnah, the Talmud, and the first commentaries, continue to be relevant to this day. Thanks for watching. If you liked it, pass it on so they can learn more. For more content, click like, share and tell us in the comments what topics interest you. See you in the next video.